Hi, everyone. Welcome to the very last speaker of the Salish Sea BioBlitz. It's awesome to have you here today with us. Today we're going to be learning all about marine mammals and the whales that live in the Salish Sea. My name is Kirsten, and I am the Public Engagement Coordinator at Georgia Strait Alliance. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining everyone from the territory of the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich people. And the whole point of this BioBlitz is for everyone to get outside and form connections and learn more about their home. And an important part of that is knowing the Indigenous territory that you are living and residing on. So I would love to take this moment to encourage everyone who is tuning in to type in the chat, introduce yourself and say what territory that you're joining in from. If you aren't sure where, the website nativeland.ca is a really good resource. So while you're doing that, I'm going to turn the reins over to Chelsea, my friend, who is helping host the BioBlitz, and she'll talk a little bit more about the event.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chelsea. I'm an Ocean Bridge 2020 Young Leader. So Ocean Bridge, for those who don't know, is a program by OceanWise that brings together youth from across Canada to participate and organize ocean and waterway service projects. So the Great Salish Sea BioBlitz is one of my Ocean Bridge community service projects. Kirsten is also an Ocean Bridge alumni, and we've been working together for the last week and for the next few days too. So I'll just kind of introduce what is a BioBlitz for those of you who haven't tuned in yet or haven't been participating in the actual BioBlitz section of this whole event. A BioBlitz is like a biological inventory, but it's not just scientists collecting data, it's anyone. So it's a form of citizen science, and the goal is to collect as much information about as many different species in a certain area and a specific time frame. So the Great Salish Sea BioBlitz is taking place all across the Salish Sea bioregion, and it goes until the end of the 12th. We're utilizing the app iNaturalist. So all you have to do is download that on your phone, go to the project, the Great Salish Sea BioBlitz, and click join. And then every observation you take in the area up until the 12th will be automatically uploaded to the project. This allows us to participate in the BioBlitz while maintaining the COVID-19 physical distancing measures that we're all required to do right now. So right now, as of just earlier today, we had 1,816 observations and 620 different species already recorded. So very exciting. We still have this weekend. So yeah, go out to the beaches, find some whales, and take some observations for us.
Yeah, I'm definitely hoping that we break 2,000 observations. I think that would be very possible and very exciting if we did. So everyone should go outside and see what they can find over the next few days. I also should introduce the organization that I'm representing, which is the Georgia Strait Alliance, and we're a marine conservation organization that advocates for the health and sustainability of communities on and around the Salish Sea, and we've been working for over 30 years on that mission. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Amy Rowley from the BC Cetacean Sightings Network. So Amy joined the marine mammal research team at OceanWise in 2020 and currently works as a research assistant for the BC Cetacean Sightings Network. She completed her PhD at the University of Manchester and Stockholm University in 2018 before moving to Vancouver and falling in love with the West Coast and its wildlife. She has broad interests in marine biology, and her recent work focuses on using citizen science to investigate the distribution and habitat of BC cetacean populations. So you can see Amy has a lot of experience with citizen science, like what we're all doing with the BioBlitz, and I'm really excited to learn with her today. So I'll now officially turn the reins over to Amy and her presentation.
Hey, thank you so much. Can you still hear me okay?
Yep. Oh, and sorry, one more note before I turn it over to you more officially. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box or the chat, and we will answer all of them at the end of the presentation. So that little housekeeping business, and now Amy, we can.
Okay. Can you see my screen okay now?
Yep.
Okay. Looking good? Okay, awesome.
Looking good.
So hi everyone, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you all virtually today. So I'm going to be talking a bit about some of the cetacean species that you might see during the BioBlitz, or that you might have already seen, I guess, the threats facing them, and some things that you can do to help. But first, we're throwing it way back. So what is a cetacean? The cetaceans are a group of aquatic mammals, including the whales, dolphins, and porpoises. They evolved around 50 million years ago. Their closest living relatives are hippos. So they're, as I said, they're aquatic mammals. They spend their entire lives in water, but like all mammals, they have to breathe air, so they have to come to the surface to breathe, and that's when you might see them. They give birth to live young and produce milk to nourish them. They do have hair, again, like all mammals, obviously much less than most mammals. It's kind of concentrated around the head and the jaw, but they do have some isolated hair follicles. And all species are carnivorous, so no veggie whales. So the cetaceans are subdivided into two major lineages or groups. That's the baleen whales, or the mysticetes, like this humpback whale right here. So they're named after the baleen, which is the structure in the mouth that you can see here that they feed through. And those are basically long strips of keratin, the same material as our fingernails and our hair, only much thicker and coarser. That's suspended from the roof of the mouth, and they use it for filter feeding. So even though these are some of the largest animals in the ocean and in the world, they feed on really tiny creatures, so small bait fish, things like krill, also herring. So they'll feed by kind of scooping a big gulp of seawater and then closing off the baleen plates, straining out the water and keeping all the good stuff inside. So as you mentioned, they do have larger body sizes. They're also called the great whales for that reason. And they have a paired blowhole. So it's kind of the equivalent of the nostrils, I guess, on the whale's head that they breathe through. Baleen whales have two of those. So the other group is the toothed whales, or the odontocetes. So as the name suggests, they do have true teeth. They also are able to echolocate. They have a special sense that basically helps them to be able to kind of see with sound. So they'll emit a series of clicks out through the nasal passages, and they have a special organ in their heads called the melon that can kind of process that auditory information. So from the way that the sounds bounce off any objects around them, they can build up a visual picture of what's in their environment. So you can imagine if you're a whale, you live in the water, sometimes it's dark or turbid, there's disturbance. So really they rely a lot more on acoustic cues than sight, which will be important later. And they have a single blowhole, so just the one on top of the head. So there are over 23 species of whales, dolphins, and porpoises that spend at least some time off the coast of BC. And 12 of these species are currently listed under Canada's Species Risk Act. So this is where the Sightings Network and citizen science comes in. So I know you guys are all citizen science pros already, but I'll summarize anyway. So basically, the more that we can learn about the distribution and the habitat use of these threatened whale populations, the better position we're in to protect them, so we can implement more effective conservation measures if we know which areas are important, the kind of habitats that they're using for. But figuring out where the whales are is kind of hard. So BC has over 25,000 kilometers of coastline and many remote or inaccessible areas. So even a dedicated team of researchers out on the water all day, every day, could only cover a fraction of that total area. So logistically and financially, it would just be completely impossible for us to figure out exactly where all of those whales are. And this is where the citizen science comes in. So some of you might already be familiar with the BC Cetacean Sightings Network. And if you're already reporting your whale sightings to us, thank you so much. We really appreciate that. But for anybody who isn't so familiar, just a quick summary. So the BC CSN is a network of almost 7,000 volunteer observers who report their whale, dolphin, and porpoise sightings to us. It's one of the longest running and most successful citizen science programs in Canada. This year is our 20th birthday, so that's really nice. So our reporters can be basically anyone. Anyone can be a BCCSN observer, so people from fishermen, commercial mariners, ecotourism operators, but also recreational boaters and just members of the public. So all these sightings are entered into our database, which now holds over 120,000 individual sightings. And we amalgamate this data and use it for our own research within OceanWise, but also make it available to other groups and government agencies for conservation and management plans. Things like deciding where to put a whale sanctuary for maximum effectiveness. Maybe if they're evaluating the effect of a slowdown area, they'll look at the number of whales that were using it before and after the traffic slowdown. We also use the sightings for more kind of direct harm reduction measures. So one example is the Whale Report Alert System, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But essentially, this is a way that we can kind of harvest the citizen-reported sightings. So the sightings that our reporters submit to us are broadcast to the pilots of large commercial vessels like this one, so they can be made aware of any whales that are in their immediate area or path, and take action to avoid striking them, like slowing down, posting an extra watch, or altering their course. So we know what cetaceans are and why it's important to look out for them, but how do you find them? So whales have massive home ranges. They can travel hundreds of kilometers in a single day. So it's impossible to predict exactly where they're going to be. So the first step really is kind of just being in the right place at the right time. You can see whales pretty much anywhere in the Salish Sea, which is the good news. So right here, this is the seawall at Stanley Park in Vancouver. So yeah, I mean, you can see here they get really close to urban centers, basically anywhere along the coastline. You just have to kind of keep your eyes peeled, you never know. Just to illustrate this point, these are all of the cetacean sightings that were submitted to us in 2019. So you can see it's kind of everywhere along the map. So a lot of natural habitats in the middle of the Strait of Georgia and Honda Fuca. Yeah, so really it's just a case of getting out there and looking. If you are hoping to see some whales during the BioBlitz, or anytime, I guess, I really recommend checking out the Whale Trail BC. So this is kind of a network of locations along the BC coast, where you have kind of a higher chance of seeing whales from the shore. So you don't even need to have your own boat or to be on a ferry. Actually, I think at least 50% of our sightings under normal conditions are from land, and at the moment, even more with all of the pandemic restrictions preventing people from getting out on the water. So yeah, basically anytime you're on the coast, it really is worth taking a look. So you can visit our website, thewhaletrail.org, to find a location near you, and a lot of them have these kind of handy signs so that you can see what you're looking for if you forget everything that I say today. So occasionally spotting a whale will look like this, but you have to be pretty lucky. Unfortunately, we don't see this too much right here. This is a bit more of a typical whale sighting, which is still beautiful and majestic. It's always a pleasure to see them. So what you're looking for kind of first will be, so the back breaking the surface. So I mentioned that all whales, they live in water, but they have to breathe air. So they'll typically be kind of below the surface for maybe around 10 minutes at a time, at least in the case of humpbacks like this one. Then they'll surface maybe 4 or 5 times in a row, just breathing in and out through the blowhole on top of the head. So definitely look out for any shapes breaking the water. If it's kind of not moving and just floating there, it's probably a log. But if you can see it emerging and then disappearing, good chance it's a whale. So you can kind of just about see the top arrow in this picture here. That's the whale exhaling, what we call the blow. That's one of the best signs that there are whales around. So when you're scanning the horizon, anything that looks like a little sort of puff of mist from the water is a great sign that there's a whale around. And even from only seeing kind of this much of the whale, just the blow, the back and the dorsal fin, that can give you a really good indication of what species you're looking at. So we're going to do a quick kind of lightning speed ID guide to some of the species that you might expect to see here in the Salish Sea. But for more detailed information, I really recommend checking out our website at wildwhales.org. We have a lot of information about all of these species and more. So first up is the Harbour Porpoise. It's BC's smallest and most elusive cetacean, but by no means the less mighty. So they are typically less than 2 meters, about 1.75 meters in length. They're quite shy. They'll normally avoid boats. So you'll typically only see the back kind of once or twice. They're quite skittish. And again, very small. They look almost like a wheel turning in the water because they swim so quickly. So they're not super social. You'll see them in kind of groups of 1 to 5 animals, most typically. It can be more. In areas of high prey density, sometimes you'll see bigger groups. They eat schooling fish, and so the status, they're listed as special concern under the Species at Risk Act. We don't really know a whole lot about the exact population trends of Harbour porpoise in the Salish Sea. They're quite understudied. But there is evidence that they are especially affected by vessel traffic and noise pollution, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So to recognize a harbour porpoise, yeah, they look like this. So you'll see a kind of uniformly light grey back, a kind of small triangular dorsal fin, and that's pretty much it. These guys don't tend to kind of do any acrobatics, yeah, but they are pretty common. So if you spend enough time on the water, especially on a calm day, you should have a great chance of spotting some harbour porpoises. So the other member of the porpoise family that you might be lucky enough to see is the Dawes porpoise. They're sometimes mistaken for baby killer whales because I guess they're small and black and white, but actually pretty different. So they get up to about 2.2 meters in length, a little bit larger than the harbour porpoise. They're the fastest cetacean in BC despite their small size. They can reach swimming speeds of up to 55 kilometers per hour. This speed creates a splashed quarter rooster tail. It's kind of like yeah, just like a big arc of water behind them. So that's a pretty good sign that you're looking at the Dawes porpoise. Again, they normally travel in smaller groups, kind of loose associations of about 2 to 10 individuals. They'll eat fish, but also cephalopods, things like squid, octopus, and cuttlefish. And they're not considered to be a threatened species. So things that you're looking out for here is, so this kind of more like, yeah, triangular kind of curved dorsal fin. With a white patch towards the posterior end. They also have this muscular caudal peduncle that I've indicated here. So that's basically the just like a kind of science word for the bump before the end of the tail. That helps them to achieve those really fast swimming speeds. So when a good way to kind of tell apart a harbour porpoise and a Dawes porpoise when they're moving is to look at kind of the shape of them as they're turning. A harbour porpoise will be more round, like a wheel turning. And Dawes porpoise are a bit more angular, so you can see kind of a bit, maybe like a square rotating, if that makes sense. Okay, so Pacific white-sided dolphins are much more social and gregarious. So typically you won't see one, you'll see a few hundred, which is always fun. They're very surface active, so they'll often jump clear of the water, which is actually called porpoising, just to be really confusing. So the group size can range from 1 to 1,000. Average is maybe 60 or so, but it's definitely possible to see pods that are bigger than that. And they're pretty opportunistic predators. They'll eat just about anything. So over 60 species of fish, lots of cephalopods too. Also not considered to be a species at risk. So to spot these guys, it's kind of all in the name. So you're looking for the white sides on the flanks. Also, so they have a kind of black beak almost. The tip of the rostrum is quite dark, and then so you can see here the dorsal fin is much bigger proportionately than either of the porpoise species, and they have this kind of white band all the way down the rear edge. So the first baleen whale, one of 2 that you might be lucky enough to see in the Salish Sea, is the humpback whale. So these guys actually made a recent comeback to the Salish Sea, which is pretty exciting. They were completely extirpated from the area, so entirely eliminated by commercial whaling around the turn of the century. They were hunted so extensively that by 1909, there were just no individuals left here. They never came to the Salish Sea anymore. And it took them 90 years to come back. It wasn't until 1999 that the kind of next individuals were seen, and by the mid-2000s it was sort of kicking off again, and now we're seeing more and more of them every year, which is really great. So it's always a pleasure to see a humpback whale. They're probably the largest species that you might see here, up to about 16 meters long. As I mentioned, it is pretty rare to see one breaching here. I know that's what everybody wants, and sometimes you will get lucky. So humpbacks are actually a migratory species. They don't spend all of their time here in BC. So over the winter, they'll be in their breeding grounds in the tropics. So most of the whales here will go to either Hawaii or to Mexico. And then starting in the springtime, they'll start coming back. So now is a perfect time to spot them. So when they're in the breeding grounds over the winter, they're a lot more social and gregarious. That's when you're more likely to see some of the cool kind of acrobatics. But here they're very focused on feeding. So this is the only time of year that they'll be eating, and they're really just kind of packing as many calories in as they can. So they'll be filter feeding on small bait fish, things like herring or anchovies, and also krill. So for spotting humpbacks, so you can see here they have a very dark grey, pretty uniform, smooth back. They'll surface a few times in a row, like I've said. On the final surface, when they're about to go down for a deeper dive or a sounding dive, they'll really kind of arch the back. That's where they get the name humpbacks, and then lift up the tail flukes, which helps to kind of push them down for a deeper dive. So you can see the tail here. It's kind of a broad sort of arrow shape. If you manage to see or get a good photo of the underside of the tail, you can see these white patches right here. That's a great way to tell who the individual whale is. So because the same whales come through every year on their migration, we have some great ID catalogs that people have got together, and we can actually tell who the individual whale is, which is pretty cool. So some other things to look out for is the shape of the below that exhale when they're surfacing. So in humpback whales, just because of their size, it's pretty big and noticeable and kind of bushy, so it will sort of spread out towards the top. So keep your eyes out for those. And if you're close enough to see the head, you can see these little bumps called tubercles. That's pretty distinctive of humpbacks. So the other baleen whale that you might get to see, it's a little bit less common here, kind of more so, more commonly found around the west coast of Vancouver Island, is the grey whale. These guys are a little bit smaller, ranging from about 11 to 14 meters. So they're a bit slower, more languorous at the surface. You're pretty much never going to see one breach here. So when they're feeding, they'll come into shallow inshore waters, so it can be a really good species to spot from land. They'll roll onto the side, they're bottom feeders, so they'll kind of just scoop up a bunch of sand and then everything inside it, so small invertebrates, crustaceans, fish eggs and larvae, and then filter those out through the baleen. So some identifying features of these guys are the kind of grey mottled back. So they have very high parasite loads, probably because they spend a lot of time kind of feeding at the bottom. So they have these weird kind of like patchy barnacles and things. That's very, very characteristic of a grey whale. You can also just about see the knuckles down the dorsal ridge. So just those kind of little bumps. And their blows are heart-shaped, which is kind of nice. We have this beautiful picture from an observer actually that shows the blow kind of coming up and then spreading out into two lobes like a heart. So finally, killer whales. I guess we don't need to spend too much time on this because yeah, everyone knows a killer whale. So they'll max out around 9 meters long, at least for a male, a little bit smaller for a female, maybe 7.5 meters. They're extremly social animals, so they live in tight family units, so you'll see them in kind of small to large groups. So they'll often surface the whole family at once, and aerial behaviors are much more common, so things like breaching, spy hopping. I should have put a picture probably, but a spy hop is when the whale kind of puts its head out of the water to check out what's going on the surface, which is kind of cool. You're watching them and they're watching you. Yeah, slapping the tails and the pectoral fins, the ones on the side of the body. Yeah, pretty playful, especially the young ones. Their diets vary quite a bit, so we'll get a bit deeper into this in a second. But so it kind of depends on the population, which we'll come to, but they'll eat fish, marine mammals, other populations eat sharks, all kinds of things. And the conservation status, again, depends on the exact population, but here they range from threatened to endangered. Yeah, so for spotting features, they're pretty distinctive. So you're looking for the white underside and the black back. That's called counter shading. It helps them to be camouflaged from all angles in the water. And especially this giant dorsal fin is pretty unmistakable. So for an adult male, that can be up to 2 meters in height. A little smaller for a female. They also tend to be a bit more rounded, whereas you can see in the case of the males, they're really just tall and straight up. So it gets a little more complicated from here. So I mentioned there are different killer whale populations that live here. We call them different ecotypes, which are basically genetically distinct groups of killer whales that have some differences in their biology and feeding ecology, etc. So the one that you might have probably are most likely to have heard of is the residents, especially the southern residents. So these guys feed exclusively on fish. They're very picky eaters. They especially like Chinook salmon. I think almost 80% of their diet is just this one salmon species of the 5 that live here. The residents are also endangered, at least one population, so the southern residents. There are only 72 southern residents still around, and they live in larger family groups. So typically that will be many generations together. So the basic unit of a killer whale society is called a matriline, which is a mother and all of her offspring. So in the residents, it's likely to be several different matrilines traveling together, kind of maybe between 20 and 50 whales in total. Usually some grandparents as well. So the second type is the bigs, or the transient killer whales, which are probably more likely to see. So these guys feed on other marine mammals, so things like seals, porpoises, dolphins, etc. They have a much larger population size, as you can see, around 400 individuals. So they were called transient because initially because they were more kind of occasional visitors. They range all the way up the western North American coast from California to Alaska. But as time goes on, we've seen some kind of changes in population trends where actually, despite the name, the residents are spending less and less time here, and the transients are spending more time here, probably because the seal population is booming as the salmon are declining. So now it's more, they're more commonly known as Bigg's killer whales after the researcher Michael Bigg. There is one third population that lives here, that's the offshore killer whales. They're a bit more mysterious because, as the name suggests, they live far offshore. So not too much is known about their biology. We think that they probably eat mostly sharks because they have very kind of worn down teeth, which indicates that they're kind of chewing on something rough like the skin of a shark. Yeah, I'll be like amazed and incredibly impressed if anybody sees an offshore killer whale during the BioBlitz. So please let me know if you do. I'd love to hear about it. So just to go into some of the more sort of physical differences between residents and Bigg's killer whales. They are quite difficult to ID. It can be some pretty subtle differences unless you're very used to looking at them. But essentially, so you can see a typical resident dorsal fin on the left-hand side. So you can even, so from this picture, it's quite clear they're a lot more kind of curved and rounded at the tip. Whereas the Bigg's the Bigg's or transient killer whale fin is more kind of pointed and more straight. There are also differences in the saddle patches, which is the white area kind of immediately behind the dorsal fin. You can see right here. So in residents, it's more typical to have what we call an open saddle. So there's sort of a little gap just at the edge where the dorsal fin meets the back. Whereas in transients or Bigg's killer whales, the saddle patch is normally closed. So it's just kind of uniformly white. So just to dive into, so focusing on the resident killer whales now and the two different populations, the northern and southern residents. It's so called because of the differences in their ranges, which you can see right here. So on the left-hand side, the southern resident killer whales do spend a lot more time, or at least historically, a lot more time in the Salish Sea than the northern residents. So yeah, typically you'd be more likely to spot them. So the northern residents will occasionally venture as far south as maybe the northern Strait of Georgia, but it's pretty uncommon. So despite the fact that they're both resident killer whales, they don't really associate with each other very much. And that's a separation of geographical range. So they also have some different population trends. So in the southern resident killer whales, the population unfortunately seems to be in decline, as I'm sure you know. They are now listed as endangered. So since 1976, the population size has fluctuated from between 70 to 99 individuals. But we're currently in what looks like a protracted period of decline. Since the late 90s, they've decreased from, I think, from 98 individuals in 1999 to where we are now, which is only 72 southern residents. They also, so some of our work has shown that they seem to have very high miscarriage rates. So they're having some trouble breeding and replacing the whales that have died. On the other hand, the northern resident killer whales show exactly the opposite pattern. They're doing fine. Yeah, lots of babies. They're increasing by about 3% every year, which is kind of strange when you think about it, because they're the same ecotype. So they both eat the same thing, Chinook salmon. So it's worth digging into to see what might be happening there. So some of the threats that are facing whale populations, a big one is obviously food availability. They need something to eat to live. So killer whales are especially vulnerable to the reduction of prey availability because, as I've mentioned, they are just incredibly picky eaters. So they have very strong, almost traditions and cultural learning. So it seems that they're not able to switch their dietary preference easily, even if they may be biologically able. So you can see here in this graph from Ford et al. That killer whale mortality, the number of whales that are dying, maps on really, really closely to decreases in salmon abundance, if that makes sense. So I don't know, I guess you can't see my cursor, but towards the right hand of the x-axis, these spikes in killer whale mortality, so times when more whales are dying, or also the times when the salmon abundance is lowest, which makes sense. So there's pretty good evidence that the decline is being driven by prey availability. So we know that the Fraser River salmon stocks have declined massively in recent years. Currently 12 of 13 stocks are listed as endangered. So unfortunately this, so the fisheries management have a lot of questions to answer, and things like restoring salmon habitat, maybe changes to fishing quotas, etc., could potentially really help out the killer whales. But that can't be the whole story, because as we've said, the northern residents are doing fine, and they eat the same thing. So another layer is exposure to contaminants, so ocean pollution. Recent studies have shown that the killer whales that live here are some of the most contaminated marine mammals in the world. So contaminants get into the water from things like fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, you name it. And this is especially a problem with apex predators because of something called bioaccumulation. So contaminants kind of build up in apex predators because it's kind of like it's like a chain effect, because they're eating a lot of species further down the pyramid. That's especially true of baby killer whales, because essentially they're feeding at one trophic level higher than their mothers, if that makes sense, because they're lactating. So if you can see in this little graph right here, I think I have, So comparing the northern and southern residents, the contaminant loads, southern residents have much higher contaminant levels. So it seems like that could be why we're seeing increased miscarriages in them and a population decline, despite the fact that their prey is the same. So another threat is vessel disturbance. So I guess, you'll spend time in and around the water here, and it's pretty busy. So in the North Pacific, underwater noise has doubled in intensity every decade for the last 60 years. And the Salish Sea is an area where there are very high densities of both whales and boat traffic, which is kind of a recipe for disaster. You can see in this little map here that a lot of the critical habitat for the southern residents especially overlaps with shipping lanes. So this is a pretty big problem for the whales. I mentioned before, they're very acoustic animals. They need a lot of auditory information. So this can prevent them from echolocating, which can in turn stop them from finding food or communicating with their families, which is really important. So that would make prey detection even more difficult, on top of the fact that there are just less salmon available anyway. It also increases stress levels. and causes them to avoid areas they would normally go to feed. So another one is entanglement. This is basically when, yeah, as it sounds, when whales get tangled in, for example, fishing gear. So this can be as bycatch with kind of active fishing, or ghost gear that's just left in the water, that's just discarded, and the whales get tangled. This is a pretty big problem. So some work from the Marine Education and Research Society, MARS, has showed that about 47%, almost half of humpbacks, have survived an entanglement incident. And harbour porpoises as well are very vulnerable to bycatch. Okay, so there are some things you can do to help protect whales, and obviously one of the big ones is reporting your sightings via our Whale Report app. I know that you're using, I think, iNaturalist for the BioBlitz, but yeah, maybe after, at the same time. Everyone has space for another app in their life. So this is the app that we've created to help reporters submit their sightings to us. It's free to download, both for iPhones, the Apple Store, and Android. So yeah, how it works, you see a whale, you can submit your sighting in real time or later. Real-time sightings are great because they're also used to prevent ship strikes via the Whale Report alert system, which I mentioned before. So when you submit your sighting saying, hey, I just saw a whale, yeah, somewhere, any commercial mariners in the area will be alerted to the presence via the system, and then they'll be able to slow down or to steer around to avoid colliding with or otherwise disturbing whales. For any boaters out there, another thing that's really important is observing the marine mammal guidelines for safely observing whales. Yeah, so I know everybody kind of wants to get close and get a good photo, but that can be quite harmful for the whales. So you are required by law to stay, oh, I think I should have updated this, but so you're supposed to stay 400 meters from basically all killer whales, and 200 meters from baleen whales. Oh, so the rhyme is if you see a blow, go slow. So essentially, if you spot any whale in the distance, you should reduce speed to under 7 knots when you're within a kilometer of the whale. So you can find out more about the guidelines for safe boating at bewhalewise.org. If you do see someone breaking the rules, you can report it to the DFO. Yeah, it's important that they're enforced. You can also report an entanglement if you see a whale, for example, that's looks like it's trailing some fishing line or something, or a whale that's just looks like it's in distress somehow. We do have a field on our app that you can fill in to indicate whether you think the whale might need help. But the best thing to do is call the Marine Mammal Response Network at the phone number here. Lastly, you can also adopt a killer whale through the Killer Whale Adoption Program. So all of the funds from adopted killer whales go to our work protecting killer whales in the wild. It makes a great gift. As I mentioned, it's our 20th birthday this year, so we also like gifts. Yes, that's a great way that you can contribute to research that is helping to conserve our wild killer whale populations. Okay, I think that's everything for me. So yeah, does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, we've had a few good questions come through the Q&A box. So Chelsea and I will take turns offering them to you. And if anyone listening has more questions that have come up, still time to put them in the Q&A chat so they can get covered. So the first question that we got is from the beginning of your presentation, and could you define what a slowdown area is?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. So basically, just areas on the water where vessels are required to travel more slowly. So yeah, sometimes in places of especially higher whale density, the Port of Vancouver can designate an area that's kind of a slow zone, so that there's less chance of people just kind of speeding through and hitting whales that they don't know are there.
Great. The next question is, are any of the species of whales capable of interbreeding?
Oh, that's a great question. So there are some hybrid porpoises. So the dores and the Harbour Porpoise can interbreed. There are hybrids around, just kind of look pretty funky. That's the only one that I know of. So most of them diverged so long ago, I guess, evolutionarily, that they're not capable of interbreeding. Even within the killer whale ecotypes, there's almost no gene flow within the between the different populations. So even though they are the same species, they could technically breed together if they wanted. They don't seem to do it ever.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Next question. Do barnacles only attach to gray whales?
Oh no, so pretty much I think any large whale is a goal for a barnacle. So you can also see them on humpback whales, for example. Grey whales are just more affected. I think it's because they spend more time kind of at the bottom, so they're more likely to pick them up. But no, so a lot of whales have hitchhikers. There are also whale lice. They get a lot of parasites that burrow into their skin. I don't know, maybe they don't really have hands, they can't scratch them off, but it's pretty common for them to have parasites. Yeah.
So the next question is, how will the slow warming of average ocean temperatures affect the whales?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. So it definitely, there's some evidence that it changes their migration patterns that are kind of determined by temperature and their movements. It also really affects the things that they like to feed on. So there's some pretty good evidence that in kind of extreme warming years, humpbacks, for example, will go closer to shore, just following the food. And then they'll be put at higher risk of entanglement. So you can actually see that in warmer years, humpback entanglements increase. Yeah, I think we haven't even really begun to kind of pass what the full effects of climate change will be on whales, but yeah, probably just pushing the range more northward. Yeah, it's a worry. It's also, yeah, again, for in terms of the killer whales, it's a massive problem for salmon. If temperatures increase, their streams are too warm, and their mass dies off of salmon. So it's really this kind of perfect storm of factors that are all contributing to the decline.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Another question we have related is what does J28, J54, A74, etc. mean?
Oh no, I'm so sorry. I should have explained. So all of the whales, maybe, can you still see my screen? We'll go back. So that would be here. So those are the individual whales. I didn't really have time to get too deep into it, but so all of the northern residents are known whales and catalogued. So we can recognize all of them, and they all have kind of a scientific name, which is the code you can see here. So it gets even worse. So in terms of the southern resident killer whales, there are 3 pods, J, K, and L pod. And then every whale belonging to that pod will have a unique number. They're just kind of consecutive numbers. So in the northern resident killer whales, A is the clan, which is kind of one level higher. And again, just a unique series of numbers. Bigs are a bit more confusing, but yeah, maybe we don't have time to go into that. So those are basically just the names of the whales in those pictures.
Thank you. Our next question is about, so it says, Danny says, are Canadian and US rules about interacting with whales in sync?
More or less. I think so I think there is cooperation on that. Yeah, I'm not too sure. Regulations, certainly last year, they were similar. At least I think they work in tandem, even if they have slightly different distances. The US measure their distances in yards, which was confusing. Yeah, and there are also, it doesn't really make sense to have separate rules when the whales are kind of freely crossing the border. They don't have passports. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. And do porpoises have a distinct noise?
Can you repeat that, please? I think I missed the last word.
Do porpoises have a distinct noise?
Oh, not that I know of. So they do have, they communicate at very high frequencies. So I think they certainly have a distinct acoustic signature. I've never heard a porpoise myself, like echolocating, but yeah, I suppose I would just be higher in frequency than most other whales. I don't know if you'd be very likely to hear it without a hydrophone.
Another question we have is about the offspring, like the interbreeding porpoises. And Lewis is wondering which group they would stay with, or if they're accepted by either group, or what happens there.
Yeah, so porpoises, they don't have a very kind of firm social structure anyway. I'm not too sure. I've only ever seen sort of pictures of kind of individual hybrid porpoises. So yeah, maybe they're just, I don't know, kind of exiled. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think they would hang out with either group, to be honest. But porpoises are fairly solitary anyway. So I think, yeah, it shouldn't be too much of a problem for them.
Do you know anything about how we should proceed to provide more Chinook salmon for southern resident killer whales?
I have some thoughts. I don't know, yeah, just opinions really. I think habitat restoration is a massive thing. There's, like, I mean, it's great trying to decrease commercial and recreational fishing, but if you're not protecting the area where the salmon are in the first place, it's really just kind of a band-aid. Yeah, so I think things like renaturalizing river ecosystems would be a great one. So they need things like tree cover along the bank, so salmon have kind of nice shaded, safe pools when they're transitioning from their freshwater to their ocean-going phase. It also helps to mitigate against the effects of climate change and warming rivers if you can shade them. What else? Yeah, I think that's the main one. I'm pretty keen on. Also pollution is a big thing. There's pretty good evidence that, it's virtually certain that pollution really has a big effect on juvenile salmon survival. So cleaning up rivers is also super important.
Thank you. I'm going to pose my own question now that we briefly talked about earlier, which is on the kind of Quadra Island, in the water between Quadra and Marina Island recently, I heard in the middle of the night, like a lot of what I'm pretty sure was humpbacks, like hitting the water with their fins and with their tails for about 2 hours, and also like a deep, what seemed to be a song that repeated for a couple hours. And I was wondering like what that behavior would be. I didn't think I could hear a whale song above water.
Yeah, that's super cool. It's really rare to hear them singing here, so I don't think I really mentioned, but so whale song is typically so what you hear is normally the male singing in the breeding grounds to attract females. I've never heard whales singing here. I've never heard them vocalizing at all. So I don't know what that whale was doing. Yeah, it's pretty cool. So normally the males will sing like a repeating song. It's always unique to each individual whale, and they'll just kind of repeat it for, it can be up to an hour or more, just to attract females basically. Just kind of advertising their quality, I guess, saying how great they are. So yeah, it's kind of the wrong place and the wrong time for that though. So I assume they do vocalize. I mean, they speak to each other, like females and calves, for example. But yeah, in that case, it's kind of a mystery. I'm sorry, I can't tell you exactly.
Thank you. Maybe he missed out on getting a breeding ground.
Yeah, or I mean, it's worth a shot, right?
Yeah.
For another question, I know you touched on this at the end of the presentation, but we had a question about what do we do if we see recreational boats and whale watching boats that are closer than the regulations? Who do we report to, and what info is required?
Yeah, so you can report to, So you can report that to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. If you just Google it, I think they have a phone number. If you go to bewhalewise.org, there's also a little form that you can report that to. I guess basically just any information that you have is good. So if you can identify the vessel, that's great. But if not, I think it's still useful just to know, like, maybe in which areas it needs to be better enforced, etc.
Cool. Thanks. The good information to have on hand. I have like a hat with that phone number on it so that I can wear it out when I'm on the water and never forget.
That's such a good idea.
Do you know anything about the impacts that offshore wind farms could have on whales? And what could be done to affect their impact?
I don't know anything about that, I'm sorry.
No problem.
I suppose if they're noisy under the water, yeah, that would definitely be a problem, which I imagine they might be. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give you a fuller answer to that. Yeah, I mean, the only thing I can imagine is that if they're noisy, it would increase disturbance, yeah, and prevent them from communicating, from echolocating mainly. But I'm not too sure. I've never really heard anything about underwater noise from offshore wind farms. I'll look it up though. Thank you.
We had another question in the chat about if spikes in jellyfish populations in warmer waters can have an effect on migratory species.
Oh, maybe. I don't imagine that whales are too bothered by jellyfish. Yeah, I'm not certain. So it might even, yeah, I can't answer confidently. I'm not too sure about that.
Yeah, these are some good questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Lots of a wide range of things to cover. Do you know about where whales go after they get entangled, or what happens if a whale gets entangled? Where do they go for rehab?
Yeah, so part of the problem is that if a whale dies, unless it floats to the surface, which requires quite specific circumstances, we don't know. So yeah, it's almost, it's really difficult to get a kind of a true number of how many whales die from entanglements. Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if they would go into more shallow waters or what happens to them. I'm not sure if anybody does. It's kind of a mystery. Yeah, so that's another reason that it's really important if you see an entangled whale to report it.
Cool, thank you. And I think we have just 2 more questions now. So the first of the last 2, is referring to the buildup of contaminants, and they're asking, can we assume that the accumulation of heavy metals in any whale will interfere with the viability of her offspring?
I think it's, I don't know if you can assume that. I don't know if it's been, yeah, I don't think it's, I don't think anybody knows that for sure. I think it's a reasonable assumption, for sure, and I think we should definitely apply the precautionary principle here. So if it seems like there's a correlation between contaminants and whale deaths or miscarriage, then it follows logically that we should just stop polluting for that reason and all of the other reasons that it's great to avoid pollution. So I mean, it'll be really difficult to kind of study that, to really nail down the causality, because there are 72 of these animals, so however many of them are pregnant. Yeah, it's difficult to get biopsy samples to know exactly how contaminated everyone is. Yeah, so I think, if we wait to have kind of the perfect information before acting, it's too late for them. But I think the kind of the correlational evidence is pretty convincing that the contaminants are affecting their reproduction. We know that they do in other species.
Thank you. So our last question, I think, for today is a question about sea lice, like the kind that are really harming salmon, if they affect whales as well.
So I think it's a different species of lice that infect whales. So I guess they would only affect whales in the sense that they kill the salmon, which so at least some species of whales, like the resident killer whales, need to survive. No, whales have their own kind of lice.
Cool, great. So thank you so much, Amy, for taking the time to join us today and be the capstone of our speaker series for the Salish Sea BioBlitz. It was awesome to have you here, and I know that I learned a lot. We've had some people already in the chat that they've learned a lot, so it was a really great hour to share with you, and I'm so excited to, check out the whale trail and see what I can find. So thanks again, and thanks to everyone. I hope that people, even though the speaker series is done, we still have 3 more days to collect our iNaturalist observations for the BioBlitz. So I look forward to seeing what everyone finds this weekend. And I hope everyone has a good Friday. So thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, everyone. Bye.